Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea is expected to see over 300,000 COVID-19 cases this Tuesday. Health experts say we may see the Omicron wave continue, with more people being infected with something called the stealth Omicron. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy rejected a Russian ultimatum to surrender the besieged port city of Mariupol on Monday. He says Russia cannot give ultimatums. Children's book illustrator Suzy Lee has become the first South Korean to win a prestigious Hans Christian Andersen Award. The International Board on Books for Young People announced her as the winner of the illustration category, one of the world's most significant honors for kids' books and illustrations.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Thank you so much for joining us.
And now filling in for Mark Broom this week, I'm Lee Seung-jae. It's 8 a.m. in Seoul, Korea, March 22nd. Over the next hour or so, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. And of course, as always, we start off with the COVID-19 situation here in Korea. We may see the Omicron wave last longer, with more people being infected with something called the stealth Omicron.
For more, we turn to Shin Yeun, who's joining us here in the studio. Good morning, Yeun.
Good morning.
So what are we expecting for today?
Well, Mo-gyan, we're expecting to see the daily tally hover in the 300,000s because up to 9 p.m. on Sunday, we've already recorded 329,105 infections. Now, this was up by 125,051 from the same time the day before, which was a Monday. And on Mondays, we usually see figures come down a bit because fewer tests are done over the weekend. Also because nowadays, more people visit local clinics to do rapid antigen tests, but most hospitals don't operate on the weekend. Another interpretation we had on Monday's figures was that we are steadily coming out from the peak of Omicron. With COVID-19 figures coming back up to the 300,000s, we'll have to see what authorities and health experts have to forecast as to when Omicron has peaked and when we will be out of this wave.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of question as to when we're finally going to see this Omicron wave end. I mean, a question I have actually almost on a daily basis right now. But it does seem like, at least according to some of the opinions from the authorities, that, we might be seeing this wave last a bit longer because of something called the stealth Omicron. Is that from what I understand?
That's right, Seung-jae. While many health experts have been forecasting that the country will pass the peak of Omicron by next week, officials have said that the appearance of stealth Omicron could prolong this wave. And this is mainly because we've been seeing countries once hit with Omicron, like the US or UK, see another surge in infections due to the subvariant. Take a listen to what the KDCA chief had to say during Monday's briefing.
Stealth Omicron is known to be 30% more contagious than the original Omicron strain. It's also responsible for around 60% or even more COVID cases worldwide. Though this subvariant won't lead to a new wave of the pandemic, we do think it could prolong the current one we're in. So we will keep a close eye on its spread.
Also known as BA2, stealth Omicron is reportedly much more contagious than the original strain and has already taken up more than 41% of all locally transmitted cases. It also took up nearly 57% of all imported cases in the country as well, but there's no scientific evidence to suggest the subvariant is any more dangerous than Omicron, and the most common symptoms of stealth Omicron are dizziness and fatigue, which usually appear 2 to 3 days after one is infected. As its name suggests, stealth Omicron has been difficult to detect with the PCR test kits widely used abroad, but South Korea has been using its homegrown PCR test kit that can detect all variants from Alpha to Delta and even all strains of Omicron.
But yeah, on Monday, I remember we saw the highest number of deaths for a single day. So how are authorities evaluating the level of risk of the pandemic, and did they introduce some measures?
Well, for 3 weeks straight, authorities have evaluated the risk of the pandemic to be at the highest level. And this comes as we're seeing roughly 7 out of 10 ICU beds occupied, a spike in the number of critically ill patients and deaths. In just a week, we've seen the number of critically ill patients go up by roughly 12%. The number of deaths in a week also went up by a whopping 45%. And to bring these numbers down, authorities have decided to secure more antiviral pills that are used to treat high-risk groups. As of now, only seniors aged 60 and up, the immunocompromised, and those aged 40 and over with underlying conditions like diabetes or cardiovascular disease are eligible for Paxlovid. And this is the only antiviral pill that has received the green light from Korea's drug regulator so far. But roughly half of all Paxlovid stocks have been used up so far. That's why the government is planning to take delivery of some 100,000 courses of Lagevrio this week. Lagevrio, also known as molnupiravir, is an oral COVID-19 pill manufactured by Merck. Now, though the government has already secured deals to receive some 242,000 courses of Lagevrio, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety has not approved its usage yet, citing its low efficacy. While Paxlovid was found to prevent deaths and hospitalizations by 90%, Lagevrio only reduced fatal illnesses by 30%. Despite this, authorities have determined an alternative pill is needed to treat high-risk patients who cannot be prescribed with Paxlovid, mainly because it cannot be taken with many other drugs. Now, the country's drug regulator will make their final decision as to whether they will grant emergency use for Lagevrio by Thursday at the latest.
I mean, definitely the high daily toll is concerning, but also the death toll. And hopefully with the introduction of these drugs, the death toll also dips down significantly as well. Yeon, as always, thank you very much for your report.
Thank you so much.
And of course, moving on, amid the ongoing shelling, Russia on Monday demanded Ukraine to give up the besieged city of Mariupol.
However, despite the attacks it has suffered for the past 3 weeks, surrender is not an option being considered by Kyiv. Our Song Yoo-jin with the latest.
Ukraine's southern port city of Mariupol has been the victim of brutal bombardments for the past few weeks. And on Monday, Moscow demanded Ukrainians put down their arms and raise white flags in exchange for safe passage out of the city. But maintaining its defiance, Ukraine's answer was no. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy reaffirmed the country's stance on the same day. Zelenskyy told local media outlets that his country would never bow to Russia's ultimatums, and cities including Kyiv, Mariupol, and Kharkiv would not fall into the hands of Moscow. Despite Ukraine's resistance, civilian atrocities are escalating every day.
It has been officially established then in 25 days of the full-scale aggression, Kremlin has already killed 150 Ukrainian children, destroyed more than 400 schools and kindergartens, and more than 110 hospitals. Thousands and thousands of civilians were killed.
Calling Moscow's brutality state terrorism, the defense minister warned international society that if the Kremlin is not stopped, what Ukraine faces today may become what they encounter tomorrow. Meanwhile, regarding the kidnapping of the mayor of Ukraine's Melitopol, Russia's human rights ombudswoman claimed on Monday local time that he was freed after being exchanged for 9 captured Russian soldiers. She said this was the first hostage exchange between the two countries, adding that more than 500 Ukrainian soldiers have been captured by Russia. The mayor was reportedly kidnapped on March 11th by Russian forces, but President Zelenskyy's office said 5 days later that he was released without providing further details. Shelling and kidnapping are not the only parts of Russia's playbook, which also includes online attacks. In a statement released on Monday local time, U.S. President Joe Biden pressed businesses to tightly lock their digital doors against possible cyber attacks. This comes after the West instigated multiple economic sanctions to target Moscow's economy and deter it from further attacks. President Biden confirmed his administration would use every tool it had to deter, disrupt, and even respond to attacks against critical infrastructure. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
In other news, U.S. President Joe Biden will meet with his Polish counterpart this week to discuss the Ukraine crisis. Before the trip, the commander-in-chief is due for talks with EU leaders in Brussels, focusing on new sanctions on Russia. Choi Min-jung provides a glimpse of what to expect.
U.S. President Joe Biden is set to visit Poland on Friday as part of his efforts to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine. White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said late Sunday that Biden will hold a bilateral meeting with President Andrzej Duda of Poland. She added that they will discuss how the U.S., together with its allies and partners, is responding to the humanitarian and human rights crisis Russia sparked in Ukraine. Biden's trip to Poland comes a day after he meets with the members of NATO and the European Union in Brussels to discuss global efforts to support Ukraine. Psaki on Sunday tweeted that the trip will be focused on rallying support for Ukraine and against Putin's invasion. The White House also said that Biden will arrange a call for Monday regarding the matter with French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Before Biden arrives in Brussels on Thursday, EU leaders will on Monday discuss new rounds of sanctions against Russia. According to Reuters, an oil embargo is being considered. The discussions comes following a series of sanctions already imposed on Russia, including 685 Russian and Belarusian individuals. Unlike the US and the UK, the bloc has yet to impose sanctions on Russian oil, as Moscow warned that it could lead to it closing a major gas pipeline to the region. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Now turning to the latest on the China Eastern Airlines accident. The Boeing 737 carrying 132 people, including 9 crew members, crashed in China on Monday. The plane flying from Kunming to Guangzhou reportedly caught fire after crashing into the hills in Guangxi Province. The country's Civil Aviation Administration said the jet lost contact before the crash while flying over Wuzhou. The cause of the accident is still unknown at this point, and over 700 emergency crew members and first responders have extinguished the blaze at the site. This is the first major flight accident involving a Chinese airliner in 12 years.
Now, North Korea has reportedly been gathering more than 6,000 troops to prepare for a military parade possibly scheduled for next month. Now, amid risks of cyber attacks from the regime and Russia, Seoul's defense ministry and the state intel agency have raised cybersecurity levels. For this, Bae Eun-ji has the latest.
North Korea is showing signs of preparing for a large-scale military parade. Many speculate that the North will hold a parade next month, on April 15th, to mark the 110th anniversary of the birth of its founder, Kim Il-sung.
South Korea and the U.S. military are closely monitoring the situation together, but we have nothing to share for now, and our military has a very strong defense posture.
An official from the Joint Chiefs of Staff who spoke on the condition of anonymity said on Monday that there have been media reports of around 6,000 North Korean troops gathered for a military parade. But the military's assessment shows that the number has risen to more than that. But the official added that there aren't any notable changes to the situation. This comes after Voice of America News reported last Friday that the North is showing signs of preparing for a military parade. Citing a satellite image, it said as many as 6,000 troops are amassed at the parade training ground of Mirim Airport in Pyongyang. Meanwhile, South Korea's defense ministry and the state intelligence agency both raised their cybersecurity levels on Monday, amid heightened risks of cyber attacks from North Korea and Russia. The defense ministry on Monday raised it from level 4 to level 3, the third highest in the 5-tier system. This is the first time in 7 months that it has been raised. A defense ministry official said the increased readiness comes amid ongoing cyber conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and concerns over North Korea's recent missile tests leading to cybersecurity threats. Citing similar reasons, the National Intelligence Service also raised its own level alert by a notch. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
And now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has expressed a strong will to move the presidential office of Cheongwade, which has long been a symbol of South Korea's presidential authority for over 7 decades. But come May, it's set to be relocated to history when it turns into a public venue upon the inauguration of the Yoon administration.
That's right. With the current Defense Ministry building selected as the next presidential office, we'll get an expert's view on Yoon's decision and what it could mean for the next administration moving forward. Now, for this, we're joined by Professor Song Se-ryun, a professor of law at Kyung-hee University. Professor, thank you very much for joining with us today.
My pleasure.
So first and foremost, I guess with just about less than 50 days to go now, it does seem like right now President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, his top priority is moving the presidential office away from the more traditional place that we had over at Cheongwon. But why is he putting so much importance on moving the presidential office?
Well, I understand he wants to start off keeping his campaign premise and not be the imperial president. That imperial president has been a kind of a problem for decades and decades. But it is a problem of a president as an institution. Power is too much concentrated, and check and balance system does not really work in many cases. Delegation to the cabinet members are in many cases largely ceremonial. Those kind of things are combined with the fact that the Blue House has a physical limitation as well. The president is too much isolated. It's not a West Wing setup where in the White House in the United States, the president and advisors and staffs are all in the same general space. So I understand what he's trying to do, but it seems like he's picking a fight at a moving to a new location, which looks to people like there's a quibble over the address of his working office. So I think that at this point, people would like to see more of a working relationship with the current administration, which is soon to be a opposition party. And slimmest victory in his election is a mandate or order from the people that he has to work well with the opposition party. So it is a problem of optics, and it is a problem that he's coming out and looking like picking a fight.
Well, like you said, this has sparked a lot of controversy in the nation, but we also saw the Moon administration attempt something like this before, but it actually didn't happen. So how likely is it that the Yoon administration will pull off the move?
Well, given that it is a problem of an institution and also physical location, I'm sure it's not an impossible task, but it requires a careful planning and probably enough time to do either a reconstruction at the same place, or if he moves to a physical location, then there has to be an extensive renovation and putting in infrastructure that befits the presidency. So it's not impossible, but it's not going to be a short-term, quick fix or a month or two kind of project.
I mean, it really did come down to kind of two options, right? You either had Gwanghwamun or the current Defense Ministry building, but eventually, I mean, Yoon Suk-yeol did select the current Defense Ministry building as the potential next presidential office. I just want to kind of know what your stance is on the decision to choose the Defense Ministry building.
Well, I'm sure as a building, if you put enough infrastructure and renovation to make it into a presidential office, I'm sure is a viable option. But there are other matters. He's a president, and the Yoon Suk-yeol is provided with residence and the working office for 5 years. Whether the decision is a good one or not also depends on whether he goes through a proper due process, which is that the Blue House has been an institution for decades. So I think that people at least has a say in it whether we want the new location or not. And also, after 5 years, what happens if the new president comes in and has different ideas about the residence? Are we going to change a residence every 5 years? That certainly is not going to be a good option. So I think that given the problem of the institution as a location, there has to be some solution, and that's why I think the President Moon also thought about moving and look for different solutions. But if you were to do that, then I think the planning has to be careful, and there has to be a consensus process where the legitimate decision to move is a sort of a final decision that will endure for long in the future.
Now, Professor, like you've just mentioned, Yoon's pledge to move the presidential office is aimed at enhancing communication with his officials and the people of Korea. But others argue that, this is just a waste of resources. So will the move really help the new administration better communicate, or is it more like symbolic or anything else?
Well, communication with his staff members is one thing, but communication with people, probably in today's day and age, physical location does not matter that much. Probably there is more technological means, SNS, more interviews, maybe YouTube channel if he wants to, which all can be done without moving. So I think that if it's an expression of his willingness to communicate with people, probably location should not be a sole solution. I remember that many presidents could have a communication channel other than going out to the street and greeting people. You have in the United States probably fireside chat to talk to or communicate to more people was a successful case. I think there has to be some way that new President Yoon Suk-yeol could use to highlight his strength and open the communication channel with people.
All right. Professor, thank you so much for your insights. We hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has had a lunch meeting with the heads of 6 South Korean business organizations on Monday. They met at the Transition Committee office and focused on the difficulties and firms are facing. The incoming leader laid out some of his visions for the economy. Our Kim Yeon-sung brings us the highlights from that session.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol on Monday discussed the future of South Korea's economy over lunch with the heads of 6 business organizations. The leaders of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Korea International Trade Association, Federation of Korean Industries, K-Biz Korea Federation of SMEs, Korea Enterprises Federation, and Federation of Middle Market Enterprises of Korea were in attendance. The 7 gathered in the Transition Committee office in Tongidong Jongno-gu District and had lunchboxes. Over this casual meal, Yoon shared his economic vision for the country.
정부는 인프라를 만들고 뒤에서 도와드리고 하여튼 기업이 앞장서서 큰 기업이든 작은 기업이든 일자리 만들어내면서 투자도 하고 이렇게 뭐 기업이 커가는 게 나라가 커가는 거 아니겠습니까?
The heads of the business organizations also shared some of the difficulties their members are facing. They claim that some of the industry laws are slanted too favorably towards the workers, and that some regulations are impeding investment and the growth of new industries. They also asked Yoon to reform labor laws and business regulations, such as the Severe Disaster Punishment Act, and to resolve the global supply chain problem. Yoon left the door to his office open by asking organization heads to provide him insight on what they find to be problematic, so that the government knows when to step in to help spur companies' growth. Kim Yeon-sung, Arirang News.
Well, staying with the next administration, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's Transition Committee has been up and running for a few days now. Now, on Monday, it released its timeline for the transition period of around 50 days, outlining how it will prepare for the new government in the run-up to the inauguration. All right, Kim Do-yeon has the details.
With President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's transition committee starting its first full week, members of the committee got together for its second all-member meeting on Monday. With its chairman, Ahn Cheol-soo, overseeing the meeting, the committee created an outline of how it will prepare for the start of the new administration on May 10th. The president-elect is scheduled to sit down with the committee at least twice a week on a regular basis.
The president-elect will share his vision and philosophy for the new government and be responsible for core governmental tasks himself, so he can show his deep understanding, interest, and drive. Through this, we expect our plans to have a high implementation rate during his term.
Specifically, the spokesperson for the committee says, except for Saturdays, there will be a meeting on a daily basis to bring each of the branches together. Chairman Ahn Cheol-soo will be overseeing 4 of the 6 weekly meetings, including the all-member meeting on Monday. President-elect Yoon will meet with the committee's branch leaders on Tuesday and be briefed on the progress of each branch on Thursday. Each branch is also expected to visit their respective government agencies once a week to meet with the working-level government officers. As for the big picture, the spokesperson says each branch will come up with a final list of tasks for the new administration by end of April, and by early May, the president-elect will be briefed on them. About a week before the inauguration, Yoon will announce to the public what his administration and his government arms will focus on during his term. In addition, during the meeting early in the day, the committee decided to expand the current Special COVID-19 Response Task Force into a special branch.
To respond to the serious COVID-19 situation, we will have up to 20 people in this special branch. It will consist of experts in medicine, data analysts for virus prevention, economic experts for compensating small businesses, as well as government employees in the health and finance ministries.
The spokesperson also reiterated that this transition committee was formed faster than any other ones in history. However, she says that doesn't mean there's plenty of time. So work will be done in a timely manner with humility and a sense of responsibility. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, in other news, children's book illustrator Suzy Lee has become the first South Korean to win a prestigious Hans Christian Andersen Award. The International Board on Books for Young Children announced Lee as the 2022 winner of the illustration section for the biennial awards on Monday. It's one of the world's most distinguished honors for children's books and illustrations. Now, last month, Lee's latest book, titled Summer, also won a prize at the Bologna Ragazzi Awards.
And now it's time for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs. It's been almost a month since Russia launched its recent invasion of Ukraine, as well as the tragic human cost. The conflict and resulting geopolitical turmoil also have grave economic consequences, and these are rippling around the world. The crushing sanctions the U.S. and Europe have slapped on Russia have certainly dealt a blow to Russia's economy, but there's also blowback on the countries imposing them. It should also go without saying that the Ukrainian and Russian economies are being hit the hardest by the supply shock, energy independence measures, the refugee crisis, and countless other related repercussions are being felt around the world. For more, we connect to Klaus Vistesen, Chief Eurozone Economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics, who's joining us from London, and Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea from Seoul. Thank you both for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. Sure.
Thank you. Now let's start with Mr. Vistesen. The economic consequences of the war are most certainly not confined to the countries fighting it. So what do you think the extent of the damage will be, and how can countries limit this impact?
Well, the damage that's being done from the war, in some sense, exacerbates trends that were already underway. So you can think about the war in Ukraine as a negative supply shock, right? So we have energy prices, commodity prices going up. These prices were already high to begin with. The war also is making the supply shock in manufacturing worse. That was already a problem to begin with. So in some sense, this is happening at a very unfortunate time. I mean, in some sense, war always is at an unfortunate time, but specifically for the European economy, it's making an inflation problem even worse and also exacerbating a supply shock in manufacturing and goods producing sectors.
Now, speaking of inflation, Professor Yang, experts have warned the conflict will trigger higher inflation as well as lowering growth and disrupting supply chains. In your view, which of the economic repercussions will be felt most acutely around the world?
Well, I think it's definitely inflation, and that's because while Russia takes maybe about 3% of the global economy and Ukraine much less, what they produce and what they export is the rawest of the raw materials, grain and energy. And that affects basically every price down the production line, and that's why it's so crucial. This war has been proven so crucial for Russia. Russia and Ukraine is a major producer of wheat, and also Russia is a major exporter of oil. Oil may be made up if OPEC decides that they can afford to produce more. Grain, I'm not sure if they can afford. Other global suppliers can make up the difference. So when the grain prices go up, it's not just the price of grain, but it's also price of meat and other foods. And Russia is a major producer of fertilizer, so almost all agricultural goods are likely to be affected, and that's probably going to be as bad for inflation as oil.
So this war really has to end because it's really affecting our daily lives as well. But Mr. Vistesen, do you foresee increased supply chain disruptions in Europe and in the U.S. as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we're only now seeing the beginning of that. I mean, again, it's always a little bit difficult to predict exactly how these things are going to play out, because also, as the professor said, it takes a little bit of time for this to ripple out through the production chains and lines, but surely we're going to see manufacturing in Europe being affected by this. Input prices are increasing at a very rapid rate. That's going to compress margins and going to cut production. We similar in the U.S. Also, just the fact that energy prices is going up at the rate they're going up means that, of course, petrol prices, airfares, things like that are going to be more expensive. So yeah, I think we're now in for a sort of a second supply side shock. COVID, in some sense, was the first, and that's almost now over. And now we're getting a second one. So yeah, I mean, we are going to see a further supply side shock, higher inflation, lower real income. So yeah, an adverse shock to the economy for sure.
Now, staying with you, Mr. Vistesen, do you expect European markets to shoulder the majority of the financial losses? And if so, which sectors are going to be hit the hardest?
Yeah, I mean, so the European financial markets obviously are closest to this crisis. So yes, I mean, in some sense, to paraphrase, they will fall the most or take the largest hit. I think we should especially look for weakness in sectors such as industrial chemicals that are very reliant on the kind of inputs that are now increasing in price. But generally, I mean, global markets obviously are going to be affected by this. But yes, European markets, especially markets which are very reliant on Russian energy. So the German market, for example, is a classic one. Especially the German industrial market is a sector that's going to be affected by this.
Now, Professor Yang, you just touched upon this a while ago, but many countries, including South Korea, were dealing with rising inflation even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So do you think price rises are going to become even uglier in the months to come?
At least for the next few months, definitely. And that is because the oil prices are likely to rise in the short run, and grain and food prices are likely to rise continually in the medium term as well. As I said, I think oil price, you do have some chances that it will fall or at least level off if the OPEC countries do decide to produce more, and if the U.S. Keeps on raising its interest rate, so the demand is curtailed, then we may see some leveling off of oil prices. But grain prices, I think, will be tougher to control because, well, it takes just longer time for additional grain to come into line. And remember, most of the grain is used as feed for animals throughout the world. So it'll probably impact not only on just grain, but also other food prices, and that will bleed into processed food prices as well globally.
Now, let's shift a little bit to energy. So, Mr. Vistisen, many countries have already started or are pledging to reduce energy reliance on Russia. However, Russia has tremendous leverage over Europe when it comes to energy. So, how steadfast do you think these bans will be? And what will happen if Russia and Ukraine kind of negotiate a peace deal in the coming days or weeks?
Well, so if we start with the first bit of that, I mean, obviously, Europe, it's very difficult for Europe just to turn off the gas or oil from Russia. I mean, it's a political decision, and if they did it, of course, that would be, I think the European economy would probably be pushed into recession in the very short run. But it's very important to understand that Europe cannot, in the short run, replace the gas, especially the gas that it gets from Russia. I mean, Norway is already producing at full tilt. They can't go to Qatar, which is tied into long-term contracts with China already. US is producing a lot, but it's not enough. So that would, again, you know, to your point, be a political decision. It's very uncertain at this point, I think, whether European politicians are willing or are going to take this step. Germany seems reluctant because Germany is very dependent on this. So the way you should understand it, it's not as if the politicians don't want to or don't think they might be the right decision, but economically, it's a very difficult decision to make because Europe cannot quickly just go out and buy gas elsewhere. It's simply not possible.
Well, the next question goes to both of you, but first, Professor Yang, were you surprised by the West's willingness to sanction Russia to the extent they did? And expanding on that, do you also think Putin was caught off guard?
I think everybody expected sanctions. Russia was preparing for sanctions. One thing that caught, I think, both me and President Putin by surprise was freezing of the central bank assets. That basically turned Russia from having a very large foreign reserve into a country which had very little foreign reserve. So now they're facing a default. They're facing what is very similar to a beginning of a currency crisis where the value of the ruble has fallen and they're still suffering shortage of hard currency. And I think that definitely caught not just myself, but the Russian authorities by surprise. Otherwise, they would have kept more of that money in Russia if they could. So that was a big surprise. And again, this kind of measure was only used in, say, Libya or Iran. So that, I think, shows how much the United States authorities and European authorities are taking the invasion.
Well, what about you, Mr. Vistisen? Were you surprised? What is your stance on this?
No, I completely agree with the professor. I mean, I think it was the speed with which sanctions have been imposed, I think, has been surprising. The nature of the sanctions have been surprising, especially, again, I agree, the FX reserve freezing has been surprising. And yeah, I also think Mr. Putin probably did not expect the US and Europe to move this quickly. Of course, there are still sanctions that can be used, especially in the energy market. But yeah, I mean, the speed and severity of the sanctions, I think, has been a surprise. But then again, the invasion itself maybe was a surprise. I mean, people expected Putin to do something, but not to invade the whole country. So, you know, here we are. You know, that's why the West probably has responded in a way that it considers to be commensurate with what has happened. So.
Now, speaking of the West's, reaction to this, Professor Yang, the Biden administration has warned China of, quote, consequences if Beijing materially supports Russia in its war against Ukraine. And Beijing has yet to condemn Moscow for its actions. So do you think China is supporting Russia financially? And what consequences, if they would, the U.S. slap on China if it can be shown that Beijing is actually helping Russia out?
Well, I don't think there's any indication right now that China is actively supporting Russia. I think what they want to do is to remain more or less neutral. So they may allow Russia to passively use the Chinese financial transaction network reserves that Russia is keeping in Chinese yuan in their central banks. But I don't think they will actively support Russia by giving them money or weapons. Now, part of the reason I think has to do with international relations. Part of the reason why the U.S. and the other Western countries are showing such a strong response is to warn China that if you ever do this with Taiwan or some of the other areas in South China Sea, Western countries can come down really hard on them. But also, China wants to get rid of Trump tariffs in the United States, and if they support Russia, then getting rid of those tariffs will be much harder, and they may even induce the United States to raise the tariffs even further. But also, they don't want to anger Russia too much because, well, Russia and China shares borders, and President Xi and President Putin do recognize that if they were to stand off against Western countries, they're going to have to do it together.
Well, what about you, Mr. Vistisen? What do you think of the chances of the U.S. sanctioning China, and what do you think could be some of the consequences they could impose?
Well, at this point, I don't think there's much chance of the U.S. sanctioning China because, again, I agree with the professor. I don't think there's any clear indication here that China is outright supporting Russia either via sort of direct financial aid or weapons or anything like that. So it'd be difficult to make that argument. I think China is going to try to sit on the fence here, try to exploit the situation if it can, but do it in a way so that it avoids a sort of a direct sanction confrontation with the West, because China at this point has no interest in a confrontation like that. And this is the case even if you believe that China in the long run is an adversary to the U.S. That story that might be true, but at this point I don't think China has any interest in outright and overtly supporting Russia at this point to such a way as to invite sanctions. So, I perceive China sitting on the fence. I don't think the U.S. is going to be in a situation where they feel they have to impose sanctions on China.
Okay, let's hope that could be the situation. Now, I'm afraid it's now time to wrap our discussion. Thank you so much for making time for us, Mr. Vistisen and Professor Yang. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, less than a week after the U.S. Federal Reserve hiked interest rates, its chair Jerome Powell says that rates could be increased even more aggressively if needed to battle inflation. For this, Kim Yo-sun has more.
U.S. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has vowed to take more decisive action to tackle inflation, which he said jeopardizes an otherwise strong economic recovery. Addressing the National Association for Business Economics on Monday, he explained that the American labor market is robust, but inflation is, quote, much too high. Powell pledged that the central bank would take all necessary steps to ensure a return to price stability. More specifically, he added that if the Fed sees it necessary to move more aggressively by raising the federal funds rate by more than 25 basis points, it will do so. The remarks come less than a week after the Fed raised interest rates for the first time in over 3 years to tackle inflation, which has hit a 4-decade high. The chief of the U.S. Central Bank also addressed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, explaining how it has been adding to supply chain and inflation pressures. Referring to the Fed's decision to shrink its $9 trillion bond program, Powell noted that the process could begin as soon as May, but no final decision has been made yet. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Well, as discussed earlier with our experts, the war in Ukraine has not only caused fuel prices to soar, but grain prices as well. A shortage of wheat, of which Ukraine and Russia are among the world's biggest exporters, could be devastating to developing countries. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the price of wheat has increased by more than 20% and barley by more than 30%. Ji-young has the details.
The war in Ukraine is foreshadowing a possible rise in world hunger as it is causing global food and fertilizer prices to soar. The New York Times reported Sunday local time that wheat prices have jumped by 21% since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last month. The price of barley soared by 33% and some fertilizers skyrocketed by around 40%. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development said Russia and Ukraine accounts for about a third of the world's wheat and barley exports. And a crucial portion of the world's fertilizers is trapped in Russia and Belarus. The advisor to head Ukrainian presidential office says the war has hammered the country's food exports.
But it's going to severely limit the export, right? Because Odessa is our port now. Odessa is blockaded, so it cannot export. Even this year, we have about 5 million tons that were still sitting and we cannot export them, and we won't be able to export them. So it's already going to hit the global supply chains now.
The UN said this month that up to 13.1 million additional people could go hungry due to the war's influence on the global food market. In February, grocery prices in the United States jumped by nearly 9% compared to the same period a year earlier, the biggest increase in 40 years. But experts say the rise in food prices could deal a more severe blow to emerging markets and low-income countries.
Wheat prices nearly doubled between January and February. Disruptions to wheat, maize, and fertilizer supply can be a real threat to food security for many countries, especially emerging market economies and low-income countries.
Coupled with China's poorest wheat harvest in decades and shipping constraints amid the COVID-19 pandemic, officials have also warned that the war could lead to global hunger. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Well, staying with the impacts of the war, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Monday that the fallout from Russia's war in Ukraine not only risks upending global food and energy markets, but could also have major implications for the global climate agenda. Now, speaking at the Economist Sustainability Summit, Guterres said the strategy to replace Russian oil may create a long-term fossil fuel dependence. As a result, countries could become consumed by the immediate oil supply gap and neglect policies to cut fossil fuel use. He also urged countries to strengthen national climate plans each year and accelerate the phase-out of coal and all fossil fuels.
Good morning. The brief cold spell continues this morning, while some inland regions even saw frost and ice. But we can see temperatures going slightly above the norms this afternoon, which will lead to a wide temperature gaps across Korea today. Then there are high levels of ultrafine dust again, choking parts of Incheon, Gyeonggi-do, and Chungcheong-namdo provinces all day long. But elsewhere should have decent air quality. There's mostly sunny skies to start, while Korea's easternmost islands of Dokdo and Ulleungdo will see rain through the first half of the day. Highs will be 1 to 3 degrees higher this afternoon, so Seoul will be going up to 13 degrees. Chuncheon, Daegu, Gwangju topping out at 14 degrees Celsius. More of a spring-like afternoon in store today. Wide temperature differences between lows and highs will continue with another round of rain in the forecast on Friday. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. Seung-jae and I will be back for another episode of New Day at Arirang at 8 a.m. Korea time on Wednesday. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Lee Seung-jae. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks always for joining us. Take care.
Everyone knows I'm passionate. Know why? Look at how passionate Koreans are. And you know I'm fast. Don't blink. Koreans move fast too. I'm creative on the pitch. People say I'm smart. Just look.